Welcome to the Massey Dialogues. It's a real pleasure to have to discuss today the implications for foreign and defense policy of the COVID-19 crisis. So today, I think, as you know, we are having Margaret Biggs and Rosemary McCarney to discuss with us this subject. I first want to explain why we have the Massey Dialogues. So Massey College is the place for ideas. Its mission is to nourish learning and serve the public good. And it believes that to serve the public good, it must engage in intergenerational discussion, interdisciplinary discussion, and sometimes intercultural discussions. So that's our mission. That's what we're going to try to do today. Massey College, the physical Massey College, is located on Indigenous land, the land of the Seneca, of the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we're so grateful for the ability to continue to do our work here. So today we will have some discussions with our two guests, who are the outgoing and the incoming Graham Center Massey College Visiting Fellow in Foreign and Defense Policy. So it's kind of fun to be looking at the transition from one outgoing to incoming. And we will be joined as well by Anowa Quarcoo, who's a Massey College Junior Fellow, who's doing a dual master's degree at Rotman and at the Munk School. She is also, so she's pursuing a master's in global affairs and her MBA at the same time. She is an award-winning communications professional. She came to U of T after a career in the public sector at all three levels of the Canadian government. And she's the co-founder of Civic Tech Toronto, one of North America's largest civic hacking communities. She's a ferocious reader, avid gamer, and an inspiring artist. And she's a wonderful member of the Massey community. We're so delighted to have you with us. So my first talk really is to bring both Margaret and Rosemary in to discuss about a little bit. Why don't you tell us about your background in foreign policy and why did you decide to take this visiting fellowship at Massey College and Trinity? Margaret.
Thanks, Natalie. It's a real pleasure to be with you today and to sort of pass the baton, if you will, to Rosemary. I was thrilled to be asked to be the visiting fellow, the Graham Center Massey College Fellow in Foreign and Defense Policy. I think my assignment was a bit of a non-traditional assignment in the sense that I don't come from a traditional foreign and defense policy or security policy background. My expertise or experience really in international affairs is more in the area of global development, and Rosemary shares some of that, but she also has other tricks up her sleeve. I did study international affairs, and I worked in the international affairs area as a researcher and on North-South issues, particularly trade and development, for the first part of my career. And then when I moved into government, I actually worked mostly on domestic issues, whether it was social policy, labor market policy, immigration policy. And often people think that doesn't relate so well to international affairs, but it all comes together at a certain point. These issues are very similar. And I often get asked by students, how I ended up where I ended up, and it's not at all a path that, you're sort of set out. You go from one to the other. But then I guess mid-career, I went back to a lot more foreign policy, particularly when I was at the Privy Council office. I was there at a time in the policy and planning group, leading that group after 9/11, through the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And then I was really lucky to have what I think was the best job in Canada as the president of the Canadian International Development Agency at a time when Canada was moving forward, and Rosemary was a partner on this, on maternal, newborn, and child health, but also our mission in Afghanistan, which was very controversial, work with a whole range of international financial institutions. So an incredible opportunity for me to learn across a whole range of development, but also foreign policy issues. Mm-hmm. So that's what I did in my career. And then now I'm mostly involved with issues related to global development, chairing the International Development Research Center Board. which I put a plug in, as 50th anniversary is coming up next week, created by the Parliament of Canada to focus on research and innovation and solutions in developing countries themselves. So a really unique Canadian institution. So that's a little bit about where I come from. Not necessarily a traditional foreign and defense policy path, but very broad. Yeah.
Fabulous career, that's for sure. I think we were so delighted and a real honor to have had you at Massey. It was wonderful. And now, so you spent the year, and now we're going to welcome our incoming visiting fellow. And Rosemary, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and why you decided to take this job for a year?
Well, thank you, Natalie, and for your leadership in the Massey community and having these dialogues. I've listened in on quite a few through the COVID isolation period. I've spent most of my career has been international, and I've worked in every sector of the economy, not-for-profit, for-profit, major law firm, major and small niche not-for-profit as well, and technology. But I came back to Canada after 5 years. I've been away in the fall, where I was the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations and to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, and which is an extraordinary experience, a massive honor to represent Canada and Canadians. But you learn so much. It's a very intense experience, and so I moved back to Canada in November, and in January I landed at Massey and at Trinity at the University of Toronto in this absolutely perfect environment to be able to kind of take a bit of a pause in the sense of being able to reflect and to engage with students who've always inspired me. And so it was perfect, absolutely perfect from that perspective to allow me to create a course in multilateral diplomacy, global governance, which I'm working on, and to do some writing and to get a foreign policy book underway. And then just have these extraordinary experiences with the Massey students at breakfast every morning, because Massey offered me a place to stay, even though my Massey period fellowship, succeeding, if that's possible, Margaret Biggs, my dear friend. And so it's been this wonderful moment, which I landed into in January, and was kind of moving full throttle. And then all of a sudden, 6-7 weeks in, we had COVID. And so when the university shut down, it's been, you have to be a little more creative and innovative to stay in touch with the students, which has been kind of fun for me, using obviously the platforms and the technology. One of my passions and things I'm working on during this period of isolation, in addition to still preparing for, I hope, when I can offer the course in September, where I'll offer it at Trinity College, because at the moment I'm the Pearson Sabia visiting scholar in international relations at U of T at Trinity College. So working on the course, but I'm also working on something with the World Refugee Council, which is to bring together the two streams of refugees and climate change, and doing a deep examination and creating, frankly, a movement, a call to action on how will we deal with the vast numbers of climate displaced who will soon be back onto the policy agenda as we emerge from COVID-19. So isolation has been interesting, for sure.
So two accomplished women, and here we are in the COVID crisis. So what are your perspective on this? How will it change, or are your work, the policy of the Canadian government? What will be the real tension that you see emerging, Margaret?
Well, first, before we talk maybe about how it will impact Canadian foreign policy, I'll just sort of talk broadly. I think we're all watching events around the world, and I guess I would focus on 3 or 4 things. First one is that, well, this may be an inflection point, or it's an acceleration point of trends that were already underway in the world, particularly related to growing disorder. Americans have pulled away, and now their leadership is also being questioned. China is definitely trying to be more assertive and to tout its model of development, if you will. So that strategic rivalry is heating up, and there are implications there for Canada for sure. So this disorder, I think, and it also affects international cooperation. I was, in my previous role in the economic and financial crisis, 2008, 2009, and we all saw the G20 step up and act at that time. There was a lot of leadership around the world around that event, and we don't have that same level of leadership and unity of purpose globally. So my first comment is on disorder. My second comment is really around potential retrenchment on a number of fronts. Countries pulling back, nationalism, protectionism, these things that also pulling in against attitudes towards others, whether it's racism. And so just a retrenchment of things that I think Canada holds, very true, and that it values, but also it benefits from. And I think thirdly, I would just point to the impact on people. I mean, we're living with it here in Canada and across Western Europe and the United States, et cetera. China, of course, but in the developing world, where it's just emerging, the impact is likely to be huge. The health impact, because they don't have the health systems that we have. People can't shelter in place often. They don't have the same the same kinds of work. They have to go to work. So that the implications can be really vast in developing countries. And of course, as always the case in these crises, the poor and the marginalized women and girls, they will be affected the most. So they're being affected economically by lack of remittances, tourism. It's just like a double, triple, quadruple whammy in developing countries. And that matters from a humanitarian point of view, but also many of these economies were the fastest growing economies in the world. We need them to be strong, and we need them to be secure. And a lot of that is really being threatened. My final comment would be, though, that perhaps we're showing with this crisis that the connectivity between people in countries. Now we'll see where it goes. We could fragment further, or perhaps there's a dawning realization that, as we know with the virus, it's a metaphor, if you will, for things that are invisible but cross borders, that we're all in this together. So people are using that kind of language, but it has implications much more broadly in terms of foreign and defense and security issues. So that might lead into sort of some other things we can talk about, but that's maybe the hopeful thing.
It has been a thematic that came often throughout these dialogues about both showing the interdependence that we have with other nations, but also the fear that our commitment to multilateralism may shrink, and at a time where we need it so badly. So, right. Rosemary, any comments on what Margaret just said, and then I'll bring in the voice of the future. Yeah.
Well, I fully agree with Margaret's assessment, and it's challenging because I think 6 weeks in, two things: a lot has been written, and a lot has been spoken, and a lot of conjecture and hypotheses are being tested. But someone was saying, like, we're in COVID-19, and people think we're going to move past COVID-19 at some point, but I think we might want to think differently, that we're going to have to keep learning how to live with COVID-19 until there's a vaccination or there's treatment, etc. We're just going to have to learn to navigate that. And I think Canadians and Canadian foreign policy is going to have to continue to be very agile and know how to tap dance, as we do so well as a middle power, through some of the big titanic clashes that are seeming, as Margaret said, these movements. And I think that I think we're still all in a zone where we think it's a few weeks or it's a few months, but the reality is the impact and the consequences, we will be with this virus probably more like years. And so some of the things that I'm keeping a watch on is some of the superpower shifts, and Margaret touched on that. We've been so much in the trenches on a Russian-U.S. kind of tension for the past few years, and all of a sudden we're watching this superpower kind of conflict tension shifted more to the U.S.-China side. And if you think about the last few weeks, there's very little news, few headlines, articles putting Russia in the picture at all, except to provide some pandemic numbers that are going on there. So I think that's an interesting one that, is still sorting. And as I say, this is a work in progress. I think the other thing is that, by the shutdown, we created a supply chain shock, which is giving us an opportunity to rethink supply chains, rethink just-in-time deliveries, which we've all become quite comfortable with and frankly, our expectations of. And so there's the rethink of that on a foreign economic trade basis is going to be a fascinating one, because we can't give it all up. And yet we know that there's some things that will probably fall more in the realm of national security, essential goods, products, services, etc. I think the two other things I would say is that we need to be much better prepared coming out of this for mass movements of people. So there's 70 million people right now in the world. 10 million are stateless. About 41 are IDPs, about 26 are refugees. There's about 3.5 million asylum seekers right now. We have not got a handle on this. And what this virus is revealing is our incredible vulnerabilities and the vulnerabilities of those people to global instability. And so I'm hoping we're going to do better at that. And then the last thing I would say is we might be in for a bit of political instability at a leadership level. Some leaders are emerging as rock stars, to be quite frank. Our government has handled this at every level. Our federalism has frankly performed so well. But other places, both superpowers and emerging powers and in the global south, have revealed the leadership weaknesses. So we might be in for some period of political instability as well, where all bets are off in terms of when elections start to happen again. But I'll stop there.
Yes. So Anowa, you've listened to them. So how does this crisis influence your work? MBA, global development. Are you steeped into thinking about these issues?
I'd say, yeah. I think before I sort of dive into that, I think one of the things that in terms of conversations that I've been having with people and sort of observations are sort of impacts on mental health. And I think we don't necessarily always think about these kind of things when we talk about, trade and economic policy. But I think about the fact that, our leaders are sheltering in place in much the same way we are, and they're incredibly stressed. And so it makes me wonder about how they're making decisions, how they're being advised, and hoping that, they're ready for crisis. But I also think about the fact that, for millennials, I'm an older millennial, and so I graduated during the 2008 recession, and I'm graduating now. And so there's this really interesting piece around how there's going to be an entire generation that, could actually be economically less advantaged than generations that have come before. And so when you start to think about what sort of this means at a foreign policy level, even just things like economic mass migration. So I know that's something a lot of people I've been talking to have been talking about is this idea of reverse migration. So folks, came to the global north looking for better opportunities, who might actually start going back to the global south because there's more economic opportunity there, depending on how the economy goes. So I think for me, that's something I'm really thinking about more, and sort of the intersection between economy and this sort of move towards insularity, which I think we're going to see a lot more of. And also, I'm very curious to see whether there's going to be sort of increases in domestic production to sort of stave off this supply chain challenge that Rosemary talked about. If you're looking at, for example, PPEs as an example that we're seeing currently, but when you start to think about other things like, machine components or telephone components or things that we use in our everyday life, what does that mean for the supply chain? And so I'm very interested to see, I think for me, where will trade and foreign policy butt heads? That idea that if the US maybe decides they're going to continue this trade war, how do you deal with that when you don't have a domestic supply chain because it's been decimated by years of globalization. So there's this really interesting tension, I think, between sort of like livelihood and like political ambition. And I'm very curious to see how they balance up. But I don't know. Who knows? Who knows what'll happen?
But I think that the tensions that you're talking about are quite real. And I think we've been talking about this here. Like we want local supply chains to work, but then we were completely interdependent, and we've been working at that model for a long time. So this crisis will precipitate presumably a new thinking on economic terms. What about what would be the impact for you, Margaret, from the development point of view? People are afraid that from now on, and it came up on these dialogues, that people are going to say, "Oh, me myself first," we're going to be in deep recession, so there's going to be a folding in. So how are we going to stop that? What do you think? You have to put your mic on.
I'm actually very good at this. I apologize. I'm good. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think maybe some of the tensions around retrenchment and extreme economic nationalism maybe exaggerated, but there definitely will be that pull. We've seen some in the middle of the crisis, of course, and Canada was subject to some of that. And the worst, I mean, we can be, it's a problem for us, but you can imagine if developing countries cannot get access to critical supplies, food supplies, medical supplies and whatever because of export restrictions, et cetera. So just on the trade part, I mean, actually, luckily on Tuesday, Canada and I think, 42 other members of the World Trade Organization came out with a joint commitment to continue to press to sustain an open and rules-based trading system. Now, some countries didn't join in that, but Canada did. And again, that's the kind of thing that if you have enough countries that don't just say that, but actually act on that and find solutions to these issues, then we can keep the trading system from really pulling in. The consequences of extreme protectionism and economic nationalism will give you the results that we had through the Depression in the 30s. We know that. Doesn't mean that there won't be a rethinking of supply chains, as Rosemary and Anowa have mentioned. There will be, in terms of reducing risk around single sources and diversifying supply, et cetera. That will happen. But I think in Canada's interest to do this in a really intelligent way and to continue to press for global solutions or multilateral solutions, and to work with whoever is willing to work with us on those issues. Yeah. So I think that's huge. I just wanted to draw attention to one other issue that hasn't come up yet, and that has to do actually with, Rosemary talked about leadership, and I think what we've also seen is a number of leaders in some countries taking advantage of this crisis to become more authoritarian. And to curb, and this is your area, to curb liberties, and I think that's another issue that we want to keep an eye on, and perhaps that Canada can again play a role. I mean, I think a role in terms of continuing to demonstrate a model of democracy that works and is and to be a reliable partner in that area. But that is also potential fallout from this crisis.
Well, plagues, big changes have created all sorts of turmoil in terms of the history of the world. So we suspect that probably there will be some extremist movement coming out of this. So I wanted to bring Anowa and Rosemary because they on the movement of people. Because Rosemary, you talked a little bit about the fact that there's huge amount of people that are stateless, that will be refugees, or that will move because either climate change or because of desperation and lack of economic opportunities, and maybe just because of fleeing from viruses. On the other hand, then Anowa talked about a little bit the movement to return to a place where maybe there's more opportunity than just staying in a place where there's no opportunities, where bankruptcies are coming on, and that there's deficit after deficit. Is there a conflict there, or is there a different perspective on where will movement of population take place? Rosemary, do you want to take that first? Yeah.
Sure. Well, I think there's two aspects. I think there's two aspects to that. I think that, as you said, with respect to certain leaders taking advantage of this, I think one of the things we're going to have to be vigilant on is that the actions that have been taken as a result of the pandemic and maybe lack of preparedness for a pandemic, we need to be vigilant in watching that the measures taken because of a health risk, a health security risk, that they are time bound and they're very focused on the disease, etc. Because measures that are taken that impair privacy rights or movement rights, etc., have a bad habit of enduring long past a crisis. And I think it's incumbent on all of us who are human rights activists to be really vigilant and hold all governments to account for this in all ways. I think that's important. I think the second one, though, and this is something that I've been kind of wondering about, is the issue of risk. I think Margaret might have touched on this. It's how we calculate risk now, because a global pandemic was one of those low probability, high impact risks, when you do risk assessments. And so those are the ones that get the least resources and the least amount of attention until they happen. Yeah. And that's the world that we've found ourselves in. And so we're making rapid adjustments because of that. But what will it do in terms of that medium, longer term, in terms of how people assess risk, how they judge the other, and risk carriers and health pandemic carriers? And I think it's important and incumbent on us again to make sure that we repeat that we're only as safe and as secure as the weakest health system in the world. Mm-hmm. And so if you're not going to move on because it's the right thing or humanitarian motivation, do it out of self-interest. And that's why this connectivity, there's nothing like a health pandemic, by definition, that is the greatest manifestation of the interconnectivity of the world. So it doesn't matter that we retract supply chains or we put up trade barriers or we fix this health system or that health system. This is an interconnected world, pre-COVID, post-COVID, and that elasticity when borders start to become more porous again, the old issues will still be with us.
So what about you, Anowa? Any vision on this, about this? We did try to close the border. There are some advocacy to close borders more, and some public health advocates were wanting to limit, to close borders for a period of time. So from the NBA perspective, closing a border was the next vision for economic prosperity if we close borders. Yeah, you have to unmute.
Sorry about that. The border closure issue is a really interesting one because, and I think this is where I sort of wear a global affairs and MBA hat, because on the one hand, closed borders make it really challenging to move goods around. So even, if you have one border security guard and you have 40 trucks, it just takes significantly longer. That increases your fixed costs. So there are a lot of sort of technical and standard things that I think people don't think about that go into trade or go into the movement of people. But I think on the sort of other side, one of the things that we really have to think about is we sort of talked about folks who, are at risk and so who may be leaving their home countries, whether it's to flee war, whether it's to flee climate change or a host of other factors. And so one of the things that I think it's really important to think about is how are we going to start determining who does and does not come into a country, right? And so when you think about are you going to not allow people to come from a place where maybe they've had a spike in COVID? And is that going to be something that's used as an excuse? So I think that this, Rosemary's point about sort of measures that have been put in a state of emergency that's very specifically linked to a health issue shouldn't extend beyond that. And I think one of the challenges from a national security perspective perspective is that, we could end up in a situation where things like COVID are being used as a segue to talk about other issues or a way to sort of blanket exclude people. And I think that's really something that we should be concerned about. The other thing that I sort of find quite interesting is something that we haven't really talked about is like technology. And there's again two sides. It's sort of the security side of technology where now people are working remotely and doing everything from negotiating, national deals to talking to their grandmothers on Zoom. And you have sort of infrastructure that isn't really designed for high volume usage, isn't secure or encrypted. And so we're actually going to run into a whole host of other problems when we think about technological infrastructure that isn't designed for the volume and the use that we have right now. And so there may actually be a change towards more remote work, but we then have to build an entire infrastructure that supports this. And then what does that look like? And then on the flip side, how do you defend against attacks? And so, when you think about the fact that a lot of, I'm trying not to use a technical term, but a lot of times wars are fought online and in the background. And so how much more are we going to see sort of cyber warfare happening? I think for me, that's something I'm starting to think a lot about, how much more are these proxy wars going to be fought online and behind, closed doors, in light of this sort of shift. So I think that I'm not going to crystal ball gaze, but I think that's going to be something that we're going to have to think a lot more about, going forward.
Because what I'm going to ask you, Alt, is to give advice to the Canadian government. What would be the 2 or 3 points that you would want to see the Canadian government do on the international scene in the next 6 months? What are the key aspect that you see as being so relevant? And I want to say to the audience as well, you can ask questions, you just have to write them on the side of your YouTube channel there, and I'll be happy to put them to our guests. So yes, are they particularly good advice that you would like to give Justin Trudeau and his team for the next 6 months? Margaret.
Oh, for sure. Well, for the next 6 months and beyond, because I think some of this is how the response, but also moving to the recovery and the lessons that we can extract from this crisis. So I'll just maybe make a couple of points. I wanted to go back to something that Rosemary said about being prepared. I think, why were we not as well prepared? And there's I'm not talking specifically about the public health issues. It's more an approach to governing and public policy that always shortchanges issues that are looming on the horizon, but not necessarily in the near term and on people's radar. And we have had national security reports for many, many years now that have focused on pandemic risk and on climate risk. And so this is a big wake-up call, I think, for us in terms of making sure that never again that issues that are so core to a government's core mission in terms of the security and unity of the country, that we don't shortchange those again. So there are practical things that we need to do on the public health front, but I think the being prepared, the lesson here about focusing on these other broader horizon issues, I think is really critical. More broadly, in terms of the implications for Canadian, foreign policy. Well, number one, Canada does not do well or doesn't thrive in a world of great disorder and uncertainty where might makes right. So I think we want to continue to navigate our primary role vis-a-vis the United States. We're inextricably linked, and we're doing, I think, a pretty good job of working with a country that's in some crisis itself, and maybe some leadership that can tend to be a bit reckless. So that's a big job. More broadly, though, I think Canada has a stake and needs to invest, and is beginning to invest in global solutions, working with like-minded partners, purpose-built alliances. It can be on global health. It can be on climate refugees, as Rosemary was talking about. For sure, it's on trade, because as a small open economy, inevitably this disjuncture in terms of protectionism a retreat from some rule of law in global trade is not in Canada's interest. So I think working on that front is a top priority. And then perhaps maybe speaking a little bit from my parish, but I really do believe that that Canada should be taking even more of a leadership role in global sustainable development. Yeah. That our prosperity, our security, our environmental future, our democracy, all of these basic core interests and values for Canada are affected by how developing countries get through this crisis and how they come back on stream. And it's whether it's health, as Rosemary said, we're only as good as the weakest health system. It's a security risk. It's also, we need the economic prosperity. We need, so I could go on, but I think that my view is that global development has tended to be what, sort of the poor cousin, sort of I call it the folk fest next to the big bands on the big stage. And I think we need to put it more front and center, because I think that's where our core interests are really increasingly going to be affected. I'll stop there for now.
Okay. Well, that's a good 6 months there and beyond.
Yes. And more.
And more. Rosemary, your 3 pieces of advice to Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau, and turn on the mic.
Okay, my 3. They're building a bit on Margaret's. I think the multilateral institutions have been working extremely well through all of this. The World Food Program is working well. The World Health Organization is working well. UNHCR, the Refugee Agency, is working very well. The Human Rights Commission. The multilaterals are working well, and Canadians take them for granted until there's a problem. And then all of a sudden we realize how much we need them. But they've been weakened through this COVID-19. They've been weakened because of misinformation. They've been weakened because they're imperfect institutions, because we created them, and we created the governance systems that have made them stumble and maybe not be as quick, etc. That's on us. And so I think Canada has such a beautiful historical role in creating some of these, and stepping up again to be part of that with the middle power alliances that Margaret used the expression purpose-built alliances. It's a beautiful expression, because exactly there are things that we will disagree with, and there are things we can align on with a range of countries that so often, in a polarized world, they'd be, oh, well, we don't work with that group or this group. And I think coming out of this, what I really hope is we have a much more fluid, multilateral system, middle power, emerging power system, where we can align around key strategic interests. So that would be one. So investing in the multilateral and trying on things that we've done well, like the Lima Group, which brought us into the Latin American organizations to look at, what can we do helpfully with, say, Venezuela? Well, I would argue too, and this is my second one, is the borders. We need to rethink border and border management. The Canada-US border is so critical and so vital, but it doesn't mean it has to be as it was. So there's a pre-COVID, there's a with COVID, there's a post-COVID aspect to it, and it's been managed beautifully. But the longest undefended border, frankly, I just find it quite a nauseous expression, because it's not undefended. It hasn't been for a very long time. We need to manage it, and manage it thoughtfully and well. And I was laughing the other night because there was an article about New Zealand and Australia on the reopening are thinking of creating a bubble. Yeah. And there was this Twitter string where Canadians were reacting to it with neighbors and saying, no way, absolutely no way should we be in a bubble with the United States. We should be building walls and so on and so forth. And someone else said, well, we should be neighbors with France because we have Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. Or we should be neighbors with Greenland because it's just across the strait. There was this 50-line Twitter feed, not one mentioned Russia. And I used to remind my friends in Geneva when I was the ambassador, I think of the Russians as our attic neighbors and the Americans as our basement neighbors. And we're crunched between these superpowers in this home. But no one mentioned Russia, and yet we have common interests with the Russians in the Arctic. We're very much joined up, etc. So I think we need to think about borders and these alliances. And then the very last thing I would say is we need to think and put health security as a national security issue. So back in 2004, we had a national security policy. 2004 was the last time we did a national security policy. And eight major threats to Canada were identified. The first was international terrorism, and the eighth was health. And I think we're going to have a reordering of that, as we should, that health security has got to come up and in that risk analysis be thought about, et cetera, because we should learn from COVID-19, but one of the things we need to learn is it's not the last one that's going to come at us. And the next one can be next week or next year or a decade from now, but we have to think about it quite differently.
So I want to hear Anowa's advice to the federal government, and then we have some questions from the audience.
I'd say it's very similar to what's been said before. I'd say the first thing is really to build resiliency. And so this resiliency has to be multifaceted. So it's not just, economic resiliency, it's also sort of building resiliency into our systems so that, if something like this does happen again, which by all indications it may be something else. It may not be a health pandemic, could be a different manifestation, so that we actually have a lot more runway in the health of our organization. So I think for me, that would be one thing. I'd say another area where there's significant value is in thinking about how Canada partners with emerging markets, so those in the global south, because I think that there's a real opportunity there. I think Canada and a lot of issues when it comes to developing countries has either been quiet or could have done a lot more. And I think that there's an opportunity for Canada to step up as a middle power to really say, we see potential in these areas. We want to broker deals. We want to work with you on these specific issues. And so I actually think this is a really, really great opportunity from a foreign policy perspective for Canada to think strategically about who some of their partners are going to be, both at an issue level, but also when it comes to its position in multilateral organizations like the United Nations or the WTO or the WHO, particularly with the U.S. taking less of a role under the current leadership in sort of this international cooperation. I'd say the third piece for me that I would give as a piece of advice is to really think about how young folks like me are going to be affected by this, and because in 20 or 30 years, we're supposed to be taking over the leadership of the country. And what does it mean for us if we don't really have the foundations that we need to succeed? What does it mean if there aren't really opportunities for progression? And so this is a much larger social issue, but I think that also thinking forward, and this is something that they have to start planning for now, because if you look at public policy, it often takes, more than the cycle of a election to address an issue. So really starting to build that into public policy, starting to put that into law, I think for me is something that would be really important as well.
This is interesting because it came up yesterday as well that we should listen to have the voice of youth and pay attention to the impact for generations to come. So I think there should be some questions coming in. So Danielle Cohen, hi. What can we learn from our response to quickly moving crises like COVID-19 in how we address slower moving crises like climate change? So is there something we can learn from COVID to climate change? Let's start with Rosemary.
Well, one thing we can learn is that we actually can move quickly, even on slow emerging issues. So I think that when we think about climate change, the data is in, and the acceleration is being well documented. So I think what we've proved is that we can move very quickly when we take something seriously and treat the risk and the threat with kind of the grandeur that it calls for. I think the other thing that we've learned is that our federalism works really well. And so when you think about climate change as kind of a slow onset emergency, there's aspects of it that are rapid onset, like the fires in Western Canada or the floods in Eastern Canada. There's aspects of it that the Indigenous people are telling us about in the North, and Westerners are telling us about in terms of crops and fires, etc. So, these crises need to be joined up. And when they're joined up, the various divisions of powers in our Canadian federal system, like a health crisis, has proved to be quite resilient and ready, and a willingness to step up. So maybe we can learn that as what we are actually capable of is quite magnificent.
That's a positive message. So Anowa, anything about, a lot of people have connected climate change to COVID, and saying, yes, we've demonstrated we can do something, but yesterday what came up is if we are going to be so poor after COVID and to resolve climate change is expensive, are we going to retreat back from our commitment to fight climate change? So, Noah.
I really hope not. I think, if we think about COVID vis-a-vis climate change, I think one of the unfortunate things is that people react to things that they can see. So, you can't really see COVID. It is a quote unquote invisible enemy, but you can see its impact. And I think that what it's shown us is that people respond to emergencies, not necessarily to looming dangers. And maybe there's an opportunity to really reframe how we think about climate change. So if you think about the fact that, with COVID-19, in a month, for example, we saw a 25% decrease in pollution in China, which is the largest manufacturer in the world. So, when we start to think about things like that, how does COVID even affect climate change? I think that's something we don't know yet, and it's something we should be asking. But for me, it kind of, not to be, a downer, but it makes it really makes me wonder how committed people are going to be to climate change going forward. I think, we might have bought ourselves an extra year, maybe, due to the shutdowns. But ultimately, I think that there are going to be things that people put higher on the political agenda. But, when we think about the fact that, things like climate change allow the facilitation of health pandemics and how inextricably linked they are, it sort of makes me sad. But I don't know. Not to be a downer, but I think, the realist in me thinks that, people will be focused on much more pressing issues until climate change becomes an emergency again, which it is. And I think people should be taking seriously. But
what about you, Margaret? Any advice on to how to learn from COVID to fight climate change?
Yeah, maybe I'll straddle Rosemary and Rosemary put it well. The COVID crisis is it's a burning platform, and everyone's getting scorched, and so we're reacting and responding. Whereas to the climate change is more of a slow burn, as Rosemary said, and that's harder to get people's attention. And governments respond to people's attitudes and behaviors, whether it's the private sector and businesses and citizens, etc. So out of this crisis, a couple things can happen. One, you can see a change in terms of people's assessment of what matters to them, in terms of their lives, the society they want, the kind of life they want to live. That could change people's behaviors and expectations of politicians. It may change how businesses assess risk and factor more of those risks into, and climate would be one of them. So that could change the private sector's behavior. And there's a lot of talk about that in terms of stakeholder capitalism, et cetera. But I think it isn't at the tipping point, but this could help push it, if you will. So, you already have cities like Milan and Copenhagen, or, they're saying they're going to shut down their downtowns, make it much more green, more biking, and that's all great. But really fundamental change is going to have to come because people take out of this crisis a change in attitude and behaviors about how they want to live or how they want to run their businesses. The other thing I would say, though, and I totally agree with Rosemary, that this crisis has shown Canada and Canadians what we can do if we work together and play to our strengths. I totally agree with that. I do think, though, that the economic impact, this is where I'm going to the other side, the economic impact of this, it's going to be a long recession. People are going to be suffering unemployment, increased poverty, etc. So people will not, there is a risk that people will think that, climate's that's a nice issue, but I can't really focus on it right now. It's I just got to put food on the table. And I think that's a binary choice. I don't think that's true, but I think there's a risk that climate will be put aside for later, as opposed to, well, no, actually that's part of the society and the economy that we want to build now. And that's going to take leadership from governments, but from citizens, and also I think from the private sector. So we can build back better. We can build back better, and not just in terms of taking care of people, but taking care of the environment.
Well, pretty much everybody has said we can't go back to exactly where we were. So it's the time to reinvent, and the leadership of the private sector it will have to be there. So I have a question from Matt Glenfield here. How does Canada's local action on financial aid for the pandemic affect our government's future foreign policy? Will our bailouts hurt or help us on the world stage? So, we just kind of helped out a lot of people, and the coffers may be empty. Will that limit our ability to help people outside of Canada? That was one of the questions that came up yesterday. On the other hand, somebody from Italy yesterday said, well, it was interesting to see the model of Canada kind of stepping up and trying to deliver help quickly to large swath of population. So any comments? Let's start with Anowa on this one. What do you think?
So something I've sort of been following pre-COVID was sort of discussions about universal basic income. And I think that, sort of the local the sort of financial aid that we've seen, perhaps, I'm not saying it will, could actually serve as a really interesting test case for the idea of universal basic income. I mean, about 7 million people in Canada, I understand, have applied for various funds, a number of businesses. And so there's a really interesting use case, I think, around how do you do sort of mandated society-wide financial supports. And I think that, we have a really great infrastructure, both because of the federalism, but also because Canada does have a social safety net that allows for, you to use your CRA number to apply for this. So I think there's like infrastructure in place. And I think that, looking back, once there's been some opportunity to look at what the economic impacts and stuff, I think Canada actually has a really great opportunity to stand at the international stage sort of as an example of how governments can step up to support their citizens and their residents. And so I'm very curious to see sort of what the fallout of it will be and what the actual sort of data says about economic impact. So it's a little hard to say how useful that will be going forward. But I think once we have the data and that comes in, we'll be able to have a much better idea of what the use case is and how helpful it's been.
So, Rosemary,
I think that's the right question. The question that was asked, it is the right question. It's not just a good question, it's the right one we should be asking ourselves. And I think the activism we've seen and the really layering in response and the humility of our policy leaders in terms of we might not have this quite right, but we're going to keep looking. What we've been watching over the last 6 weeks, I think it's probably given us a greater license or tolerance for activist government again, which we've always had in this country. But I think it's ebbed and flowed, and I think that the response this time will actually, and because of what's going to happen in terms of the length of the economic crisis coming, Canadians will come out of this stronger at an individual household level because of the social policy that's been being rolled out. Now, it's costing for sure, but Canadians at a household level will be better off than a lot of other democratic countries around the world because of the policies that have been taken. And I fully agree with Anowa that, there'll be a good debate about universal basic income as opposed to, a number of segmented policies that are trying to fix certain things. And we're going to have like an intelligent, well-informed conversation about that, which is overdue, in my view. And I think the third thing I would say is what I love about what's happened so far is that there's been this great social policy come out day after day after day, pretty well conceived. And when it's not, hey, we'll fix it. We're going to deal with this. But we haven't let go of our official development assistance policy. So Minister Gould has been really consistent, and the government of Canada very consistent that our obligations, our responsibilities to the world have not taken a backseat. It's tough, but we are an interconnected world. Canadian principles and values are such that we're going to put the money where the vulnerabilities are most acute, and we're going to put it through, top flight Canadian civil society and our multilateral partners. And I think that, to you, that question, it will stand us in very good stead as we come out of this to be an influencer where our voice counts on the global stage about how to manage through crisis and how to not just build back better, as Margaret said, but to reopen smarter.
So, Margaret, any thoughts on whether the way in which we've managed the crisis helps or hurts us on the international scene?
Great. I like reopen smarter. I like that one. That's good.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple things. I mean, I think the fact that, Canada's not the only country, but we've just tried to keep a lot of people and a lot of businesses afloat, putting liquidity out there in people's bank accounts and businesses, et cetera, to sort of bridge, if you will. And that's good for Canada and Canadians. That's what we absolutely, and everyone agrees that that's the right thing to do, I believe. But also, if countries like Canada and other Western economies really slide, that's going to only hurt and ripple through the transmission to developing economies. So it's in everyone's interest that we try to prevent a worse economic shock. Number two, I agree with everybody, with my two colleagues here, that the crisis is a health crisis that's also led to a contagion, an economic crisis. We've never shut down an economy before, and what it's revealed is gaps in our social policy and our social safety net. Some which we knew were already there. We knew that there were big chunks of our labor market that were not covered by our existing instruments like employment insurance. Mm-hmm. And some new ones have been exposed. So this is an opportunity that's, like, I call it an inconvenient truth. It's exposed inconvenient truths about our existing social policy, which in relatively good times, or when people don't really care so much about those essential workers, that we've just tended to ignore. And now I think the spotlight's been put on those issues. And as my colleagues have said, it's time for Canada to take stock and think about how we can do better. One little anecdote, it was in the papers again today that we're going to give a top up to workers and protections for essential workers for a couple more months. Well, what about after a couple more months? So what about before? So my final point, though, and I think some of these lessons I think Canada can also use in its international and its foreign policy, even issues around labor protection and how you ensure that, that workers are protected. There's big international relevance for that. The third thing I'd say, though, is that there is a strand in Canada that can get played up that says that charity begins at home. And we've seen that. We saw that in the last election. We've seen it a little bit even through this crisis. That we can't afford to spend a penny out of the country because we've got to take care of our own first. I don't believe that's true about Canada. I think we can afford to do more. But also, as we said earlier, our interests are so inextricably linked with other countries that I think that it's a smart thing and the right thing to do. So I just think that we have to push back against that tendency to think that we just have to sort of bunker down and focus on our own issues right now.
Well, actually, it's that's been really a fascinating issue, because indeed it's such a good introduction to the next speaker that we'll have on Massey Dialogues, where we're going to have Jerry Diaz talking about protection of workers' rights and all the essential workers protection that's so needed. But I want to just give you the opportunity just to say a couple of few concluding remarks before I thank you. And let's start with you, Rosemary. A few concluding remarks for our audience. It's been such a rich discussion. I want to thank you so much for this. Yes, Rosemary.
Well, let me thank you and also for all of the questions. They're terrific questions. I am a big believer in multilateralism. And so when I said we have to learn to manage borders like the US border, we have to learn to manage interdependency and codependency across the world. We have to learn to manage it better, and we have multilateral institutions that need work, need reform, need financing, need oversight, but we've got the institutional network to be able to do that. And so, I think that we have to keep asking the questions, what can we choose to do coming out of this? What do we have to take forward that's a given? And what can we reframe like the climate discussion. It is not, as Margaret said, a zero-sum game. It's not about a bipolar kind of yes-no approach, cost too much, cost too little, etc. I think we can have those discussions now, because I think this crisis has caused everything to be back on the table, because it has exposed the deep and systemic problems that we had before COVID.
So, Anowa, concluding remarks?
I'd say, in spite of our current reality, we should still be hopeful. There's a real opportunity to think about the kind of future that we want to build, both as individuals, but also collectively as society. So I think what I would say is, both to our leaders as well as to folks who don't consider themselves leaders, I think everyone is a leader in the space that they are. But I think really thinking about what that future could look like and how we can be active agents in charting that future. I think for me, that would be my parting words.
C'est tellement beau. And you, Margaret, your concluding words?
Well, I can't do any better than that. I agree with my colleagues. If I could say, I think the risk here is that we're going to retrench. That's going to lead to conflict and disunity. But I think my hope is, like we just heard, is that we're stress testing our society, right? The financial crisis was a stress test of our financial institutions. We're stress testing our society, what kind of society we want. And I think that hopefully this crisis will fuel a greater sense of social solidarity, of innovation, and that we'll come out. There will be a price, but that we will come out more resilient and more together. So there you go.
Well, fabulous conversation here. Thank you so much. It was great to have all three of you to discuss these big issues, and we will continue to think about this. It's the time to be creative and to think hard about the future that we want. So thank you so much for being here today, and we'll talk to you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.